second day of our conference, State and Religion in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Austria. Ne se čuje? Ok. Mikro. Tehnika. Evo, super. Sada. Dobro jutro svima. Dobrodošlicu u drugi dan, na radnom danu našu konferenciju Država i religija u Bosni i Hercegovini i Austriji. Mi ćemo sada imati prvi panel. Srdačno pozdravljam svi prisutni, gospodin ambasador Prozlo, predsjednik Austrijskog društva, kulturno društvo, ima zadatak da predstavlja govornici. Now in English, welcome to the second day, the working day of our conference. Happy to see you here early in the morning. Mr. Ambassador Prozl has the task as moderator to introduce the speakers. And I would like to welcome all the speakers. Happy to have you here. And of course, we're all quite excited to hear what we will hear. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Good morning from my side. First, just to know that you know I am a retired ambassador. I've retired 5 years ago after a career in the Austrian diplomatic service. We have today hard work in front of us. We have 4 panels, starting from history, going to the future. So it will be a very interesting exercise that we are going to do. The first panel that you see here will be dealing with Bosnia and Herzegovina and Austria, the history of an encounter. We have 3 panel members. First, Professor Kasumovic. She is assistant professor in the Department of History, University of Sarajevo, had a master degree of the University of Zagreb, and a PhD in the Faculty of Philosophy in Sarajevo. And her main interest is, not surprising, since she's in our panel, history of Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 19th and 20th century. Next to her is Professor Thomas Simon. Professor Thomas Simon has his PhD in law of the University of Freiburg in Germany. And he is a research associate. He has been for many years a research associate at the Max Planck Institute for European Legal History in Frankfurt. Then he was lecturer, habilitation 2001, and then professor in Köln and in Erlangen. And since 2005, he's professor for Austrian and European legal history at the University of Vienna. And by the way, he was also president of the Viennese Society for Legal History. His area of research is history and theory of legislation, constitutionalism and parliamentarism in multi-ethnic states, and the legal systems in Southeastern Europe in the 19th and 20th century. To my right is Dr. Shivada Shushko. She, as you probably all know, is director of the Institute for Islamic Tradition of Bosniaks here in Sarajevo. And as you know, this is the research institution of the Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She's also assistant professor for international relations and teaches history, politics, and society of Southeastern Europe. And her PhD thesis that she is about to publish is the issue of loyalty, the reaction of the Bosniaks to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She studied in several cities, just mentioned Heidelberg, Hamburg, Florence, Madrid, Ottawa, and Ramallah. Without further ado, I would like to Professor Kasumovic to start with her speech. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my presentation is titled in a somewhat modified way compared to the program, and is how well the Swabian or Austrian can put things in order. The image of Austria in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 1878, 1918. For the start, I need to clarify something. The first part of this title is a quotation from the story Tuba by Petar Kocic. I thought it was suitable for this presentation because it can be interpreted in several ways. First, as irony, critique of Austro-Hungarian rule that dared come to Bosnia and Herzegovina and put things in order or criticize the local population. But we can also perceive it in a different way. We can understand it as seeing that Austro-Hungarian rule put things in order here. And I need to explain the term Swabian for the sake of political correctness. In Austro-Hungarian period, it had both positive and negative connotations. Swabians were actually all those who spoke German and came either from monarchy or from other parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina where German was spoken. So they could be referred to as newcomers or suitcase bearers, so to speak. But there was, because there was the general opinion that anything Swabian was good and progressive. When I make presentations about the perception of the other, creating the image of the other, I like to start with a quotation from the book The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. And she says, otherness is a fundamental category of human thought. Thus, it is that no group ever sets itself up as the one without at once setting up the other over against itself. Thus, in parallel with creating auto-images, communities and groups create hetero-images, thus creating two sides of the coin. Invoking stereotypes for foreign communities corresponds with the attempt to build one's own identity. The question is, why is this happening? Why do we need stereotypes? The answer is the following. People feel the need to simplify, to rationalize, to schematize, because it helps them ease their way around a complicated system of differences and changes. When we talk about the image we create of someone that is different, we have to say that this image is always a complex one. It is a multidimensional one because it is created by more than one entity. This image is not given once for all. It is variable and it depends on several factors, on political, social, economic, political changes and the like. It also has to be understood in the context of the time when it is created. We cannot take it out of that context. During the Austro-Hungarian rule, the image of the monarchy was created by several entities. First, the administration itself, then local population, but also the foreigners who come and visit Bosnia and Herzegovina, travel writers, journalists, adventurers, etc. This image in different forms was created after 1918, and we can see it in the political, historiographic, literary and other discourses. It is created in different ways, by imagination, generalization, domination or discrimination, and it is always almost necessarily associated with binary oppositions. All this makes the research of this problem more complex. I chose for this conference to discuss how local intellectual elites created the image of Austria in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the Austro-Hungarian rule as its contemporaries. This is possible because the elites left textual trace behind. When it comes to ordinary people, I'm afraid that we will not have the perception of these small, ordinary people. And this is a regret of historians because there are no written traces of ordinary people that we could analyze and use as a basis for our conclusions. When using the term intellectual elite, one has to be very cautious because this notion is very flexible. It implies a wide spectrum of different kinds of intellectuals, like theologians, pedagogues, writers, doctors, etc. How an individual creates an image of someone or something will depend on several factors. On the level of their education, life experience, environment in which they live and work, the social status, or political views, which was very important very often in Bosnia. One needs to bear in mind the fact that the image created on foreign rule often represents a response to anti-colonial stereotypes and countering Orientalism and subalternity. In order to capture the outlines of the image of Austria in the public discourse at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, I used various texts, press articles, various pamphlets, didactic or similar writings. Since the national self-determination was a burning issue of that time, the creation of hetero images in Austria I followed in three dominant national groups: Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats. On selected examples, of course. Here I need to emphasize that I do not perceive national communities in an essentialist sense as naturally given forms, but rather along the lines of Benedict Anderson, I see them as constructs changing over time. Now something about the context in which the image of Austria is created. The occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1878 was a turning point in the history of this country. European powers had, almost overnight, changed the destiny of the erstwhile Ottoman province. The country, which had for several centuries been tied to the Oriental civilizational circle, was to be occupied and ruled by an alien, European, and importantly, Christian country. The population received in disbelief the news about the occupation, notably Serbs and Bosniaks, who had put up the strongest resistance against the occupation of the country by foreign troops. 15 years after the establishment of the Austro-Hungarian rule in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the struggle of Bosniaks for Vakuf Mari for autonomy and the struggle of Serbs for religious educational autonomy started. The political life in the country after the death of Kalaj, the Common Finance Ministry, was somewhat liberalized with the arrival of Burjan, and the first political parties were formed in the country. And after that, the country soon got its constitution and assembly. In the context of landmarks of the socio-political life of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Austro-Hungarian period, we need to observe the creation of hetero images on Austria, its rule, its officers, etc. The ethnic or national groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the Austro-Hungarian period were politically polyvalent. In each one of them, one could find a faction that opposed the government, those who were ready to strike a compromise, and finally, a third group that cooperated with the government, provincial government, without much friction. The negative image of the monarchy was created back in the 1880s by intellectuals who gathered around the magazine Bosanska Vila, Bosnian Fairy, a sub-literary magazine with a national ethnic orientation. The editors of the magazine, Kašiković and Nikashinović, regarded the Emperor Franz Joseph as not being the sovereign of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they constantly insisted on the fact that the Ottoman Sultan was the sovereign of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Legally speaking, that was the case. In practice, this was felt most, that the Sultan had the bare sovereign right. They found the monarchy's cultural policy strange, and notably the strategy of building a Bosnian nation, the integral Bosnianness, as it is referred. The cultural policy of the monarchy provoked a fear of alienation and the loss of national identity, interwoven with tradition and strict patriarchal principles. The phrase Bosnian nation negated their mythical understanding of history and nation, and if accepted, it could lead to the annulment of all results achieved by the Serb national movement in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which at this time was the most developed. That is why anything that was foreign and unknown, such as fashion, science, civilizational achievements, were regarded as odious, while the preservation of their own national identity by respecting the antiquities and preserving the authentic peasant culture became imperative. Swabians, Austrians, became a synonym for the city, a decadent environment that destroys tradition, while the village became a notion carrying all kinds of positive connotations. The new administration was nothing more than colonizers and subjugators. The circle around the Bosnian ferry criticized the monarchy's language policy in particular. The new administration, according to the views presented in this magazine, destroyed their native language, referring to it as the language of the land, so changing its name, and introducing a host of Croatisms in the language. Similar views can be found in other magazines. Serb magazines. For example, Mostar-based magazine Zora or Dawn indicated to the same problem of language, although this magazine did abandon the folklore-based nationalism of Bosanska Vila. But it still fostered the idea of Serbhood. The same ideas can be found in Petar Kocic in early 20th century, who found the language of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy as, I quote, an abominable linguistic monster. According to Kocic, the language of the new administration had nothing to do with the vernacular language. It was as alien to him as was the new rule. Kocic also thought that language was not only a means of alienation, but of total separation from the native people. He tried to illustrate this in the following way, another quotation. For many years, orders were issued that people did not even approximately understand, and people shrugged in doubt, not knowing whether they were convicted or acquitted. End of quote. Kocic observed with suspicion various institutions developed by the Austro-Hungarian administration. For example, he wrote a text for which he was prosecuted, where he discusses the issue of urban municipalities that for which he uses the expression of false parliamentarianism. And he refers to administration as an absolutist police system of tutorship. He spoke negatively about the administration's civil servants. Very often he called them colonial bureaucracy that looked down on the domestic people and mistreated them. Kocic's nationalism, for Kocic's nationalism, we can say it is anti-absolutist and anti-colonial. A similar form of nationalism and criticism of Austro-Hungarian rule can be found in writers gathered around the magazines Narod, People, and Pregled Review, with somewhat changed discourse, which pretended, not always with success, to be a scholarly journal. They purported that colonization was felt in all spheres of life, especially in science. For Radulovic, for example, who wrote for these magazines, the Austro-Hungarian policy in Bosnia and Herzegovina was even racist. The emergence of Mlada Bosna, Young Bosnia, completed the circle of Serb nationalist narratives on Austro-Hungarian rule by reverting to Occidentalism, which was characteristic of Bosanska Vila as well, Bosnian Ferry. Unlike Bosnian Ferry, Jovan Vidic, the founder of Prosveta magazine, welcomed the Austro-Hungarian cultural mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina and advocated the annexation of this region as soon as possible. He closely cooperated with the provincial government. In it, he saw the liberator and the torchbearer, and he thought that the occupation of Bosnia by Austro-Hungarian Empire liberated his people from the burden and violence of the previous rule. As expected, Vidic could not hold for long. He soon left Sarajevo and completely disengaged himself from the magazine. Unlike Serbs that had prevailingly negative attitudes regarding the monarchy, Croats were expected to accept without any criticism all the legacy which the new rule brought along to Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, among the Franciscans, there was political pluralism that prevailed. At first, they were very enthusiastic with occupation, with the new rule. For them, it was also the liberator. For example, General Filipovic is a glorious hero, bringing freedom, etc. But with time, disappointment was felt in them as well, mainly because Austro-Hungarian rule failed to resolve the agrarian issue that was to be a burning issue over the 40 years of the rule. For example, Antun Knežević, who criticized the idea of Bosnianness policy, is interesting. He regarded that the Bosnian nation should be built in a different way, very often referring to the Middle Ages and everything that Bosnia had at that time. He especially criticized the officers, thinking that they are unconscientious, blasphemous, bribable, greedy, hypocritical, and unjust. As for other magazines with the Croatian prefix, I think that in historiography, they very often were referred to as a Kofferbesitzer, or foreign newcomers carrying new suitcases. For example, Silvija Strahimir Kranjčević gathered not only Croatian but also Serb and Bosniak writers in the magazine Nada or Hope. When it comes to Bosniaks, the provincial government in Sarajevo took particular care of them. Their position was specific, given the ties to the Ottoman Empire and the apathy which prevailed among the people after the occupation, and which manifested itself in mass emigration of this group of the population toward the Ottoman Empire. That is why Austro-Hungarian policy toward Bosniaks had to be very nuanced and cautious, especially in terms of landowners or elites. Much effort was invested in collaboration with the leading personalities, such as Mehmed Beg Kapetanović Ljubušak, who from the very start had a very good cooperation with the new rule and several times was very open in supporting the provincial government, defended its interests, and even at start accepted the idea of Bosniakness. Later on, through the Bosniak magazine, he left this idea and gave a new appearance to the Bosniakness. Ljubušak Mulabdić, Osman Nuri Hadžić, they all cooperate and thought that the modernization process in the society was to be accepted. But Mulabdić, Hadžić, and Bašagić separated from Ljubušak. They didn't like the concept of the magazine, and they were gathered around the Behar or Blossom magazine and stood for the idea that the local population needed the modern achievements and legacy, especially in terms of education. This is something they insisted on, the education of young people, girls, etc. But they thought that the acceptance of modern achievements had to be selective, and that morality and customs and fundamental values of the Muslim way of life must not be compromised or threatened. They endorsed progressive European ideas, aspiring to paint them in local colors. They were also aware of negative perceptions on the inhabitants of Bosnia and Herzegovina made by foreigners. They often felt the need to counter such perceptions by presenting their own images. Thus, Osman Nuri Hadžić once wrote in Behar or Blossom magazine that throughout history, the Christian civilization intentionally used the term Mohammedans rather than Muslims, wishing to deny Islam the significance of the divine revelation. Similarly, the term prophet was used in cases when the term messenger was to be used. Considering the fact that these terms were frequently used in newspapers and official government publications, the Hadj's article can be taken as indirect criticism of the government, of the rule. Once Safet Beg Bashagic reacted to the research of anthropologists from the monarchy who conducted their research and wrote about them in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He thinks that they wrote about Muslims, especially negatively, without knowing them. And it was, for him, too many of the foreign doctors who came to Bosnia and Herzegovina for the sake of some geschäft and then wrote whatever they liked. The provincial government tried to project a special image of its own achievements in an exotic country for many officers. This image was based on accomplishments such as building railways, repairing old and building new roads, building industrial plants, opening schools and reading rooms, insisting on modern urbanization policy, and introduced European legacy without which one cannot imagine a civilized environment. How this image was perceived depended on the observer or beholder. For instance, tourists visiting Bosnia as part of various organized excursions coordinated by the provincial administration were usually impressed by everything achieved in Bosnia from 1878 onwards. For example, the Swedish geologist August Heimer, who visited Bosnia in 1903, he was thrilled, and he left a travel account of his journey where he admired everything that the administration managed to do in this country. The country was very nice to him, but he kept repeating that the Austro-Hungarian rule was far-sighted and that it always knew what to do with the country. According to him, Austro-Hungary brought peace to this, I quote, country soaked in blood and make it enjoy the comforts and amenities of civilization, unquote. Journalists, writers, and generally intellectuals of Slav origin offered less praise for the monarchy and its achievements. For example, Masaryk described Kalai's administration and policy as pure absolutism and considered social circumstances in the country as being unsatisfactory. The Czech journalist Josef Holeček is very interesting to me. He wrote about Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he was very fond of the whole Balkans. He thought that Bosnia and Herzegovina under Austro-Hungarian rule was nothing more than American Wild West. For him, it was a colony with a widespread military and police apparatus which suppressed the freedom of local population. He even suggested that the occupation physically marred the local population. Nevertheless, it was a woman who provided the most negative image of the monarchy, Jelica Belović Bernarđikovska, who spent some time in Bosnia working as a teacher. Her memoirs are kept in the historical archives in Sarajevo, and when one reads them, there's an impression that he was really embittered with everything she saw in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And she says, this is what the cultural mission of Austria in Bosnia looks like. The price paid for it is immortality and the poisoned youth of my people. All these examples testify to the argument that hetero images of Austria and Bosnia and Herzegovina, created at the turn of 19th and 20th centuries, are really complex. Whether these images were positive or negative depended on several factors: historical context in which they were created, political views of individuals or groups projecting them, as well as their educational level, economic and social status, flexibility, and the like. While they can be roughly divided into positive and negative ones, it is fair to say that they are still not black and white images. They vary from absolutely negative claims that Austro-Hungarian administration is a colonizer, destroyer of national order and interest, to those saying that it also brought some positive novelties such as developed infrastructure and education, to those that almost mystified its civilizational mission. These were the thoughts of elites. What the ordinary little man was thinking about this is hard to say, since, as Hannah Arendt says, those who were forgotten by their own time were mainly forgotten by history as well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Krasumovic, for your very interesting and comprehensive presentation. Now we have Professor Simon speaking about his subject.
Yeah, Mr. Ambassadors, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. To begin with, I would like to narrow down the very broad topic of my talk as listed in the program. I will be speaking about two things. First, I will start by making a few remarks on the question of the fundamental political and legal ideas that underpin and characterize the modern European constitutional state. I will then look at when, how, and under what conditions this model was introduced in Austria. Starting with point one. As is generally known, the basic model for the Western constitutional state emerged in the Atlantic region, initially in England, and was then first formulated in what is still its valid form today in the United States and France. The latter two, the earliest constitutional states in the modern sense of the term. In the main, the groundwork for this model was laid during the 17th and 18th centuries in the legal theory based on Enlightenment natural law, as well as in the political discourse that arose in the context of the independence movement of the English colonies in North America and the French Revolution. This was where what has remained the foundation of the constitutional state in the West, basically until today, was first conceived. Three essential motifs should be highlighted here. First, the idea of original, complete, it is unlimited freedom of the individual in his pre-social condition. This was the starting point for the concept of fundamental and human rights. Second, the idea that the only legitimate rule is that which can be traced back to a constitutive act of will on the part of the people, through which the people entrust the ruler with the exercise of rule, and where the ruler, in the exercise of that rule, remains bound to the willing consent of the people. And finally, third, the idea of a comprehensive and conclusive set of legal regulations and codifications for the political system, thus established in the form of a constitution, which then forms the only legitimate basis of state rule in any form. As is well known, the central figure here was the so-called social contract or contract of submission. The chain of reasoning begins with the idea of natural freedom of men. In a state of nature, so runs the natural law theory of the state, they are completely free. Free, but faced with a constant threat to their existence from aggressive neighbors. In order to escape this life of constant existential threat, humans are forced to found states in which the power to enforce internal peace must be made over to an individual, the ruler. For this purpose, they appoint a ruler and in submitting to his rule, relinquish their natural unlimited freedom. The rule of the monarch is not thought of here as something originary, as something which ultimately has always been constituted as a part of some God-given order, and which is legitimated through its tradition alone. Rather, it is an institution founded through a rational act of will by the people. Rule is therefore based on the consent and on the will of those who then submit themselves to the rule they themselves have founded. This means that all governing power is interpreted as conferred. The origin of all legitimate rule lies in a voluntary act of transfer made by those who, in doing so, simultaneously submit to that rule. However, this act of submission does not, as emphasized above all by later 18th century natural law, does not affect the core of original human freedom. For in the act of submission, men only relinquish their freedom to the extent absolutely necessary in order for the state to fulfill its core function, namely to guarantee safety. It is in this remaining core of individual freedom, which precedes the formation of the state, that human rights are rooted. In the legal philosophy of natural law, human rights are conceived as rights of freedom that exist prior to the state, and therefore their continued existence is independent of positive law as laid down by the state. This leads us to a dilemma. On the one hand, a strong state is necessary in order to suppress violence. But the efficient exercise of state power also presents a permanent threat to that very freedom which, even after the act of submission, remains intrinsic to the individual. The concept of the Western constitutional state represents the attempt to resolve this dilemma. The manner of doing so put forward is that where the action of the state might become a threat to the freedom of the citizen, these actions require the consent of the people. In other words, any encroachment on the freedom of the citizens requires the prior consent of all citizens. The people thus transfers its consent-giving power to elected representatives. These representatives of the people then decide to what extent and under what conditions the state may encroach on the freedom of the citizen. This is a function of an official parliamentary law. It regulates the condition and the extent to which the power of the state may limit the citizen's sphere of freedom. This results in a separation of power between, on the one hand, a parliament that set norms, and on the other, the institutions that implement these norms. It is the monarch or the president and the governments installed and appointed by them. All this has fed into the emergence of a typical structure and content for constitutions. Two parts. First is they organize three state powers, each of which is assigned a limited sphere of competence. This is a part of the constitution that governs the organization of the state. And the second part is a catalogue of fundamental rights, usually. Second question, when and how did this model become a constitutional reality in the Austrian Empire? In the German states, including Austrian Empire, within the German Confederation. The Atlantic Western European model, as outlined here, was initially only able to gain a foothold in a watered down and less radical form. This can be seen in particular in the following points. First point, while the Atlantic constitutional model, it has the Constitution of the United States and the Revolutionary Constitution of France, they are built on the theoretical foundation of people sovereignty. The German version of constitutional monarchy was based on the idea that actually all state power remained united in the hands of the monarch, and the parliament was merely granted the right to participate in the exercise of power on a case-of-case basis. Second point, consequently, the act of granting a constitution also remained in the hands of the monarch, the German model. Typically, the constitutions of German constitutionalism were not passed by an elected National Assembly with constitution-making power, but were granted by the monarch himself. Third point, the type of constitutional monarchy established in the states of the German Confederation, including Austria, over the course of the 19th century, firmly upheld the monarch's dominant position of power. Parliament's role in passing law was reduced to mere participation. Monarch and parliament had to work together on legislation, but no law could come into effect without royal consent. In contrast, the Atlantic Western constitutional model, the final say in the lawmaking process lay and lies with the legislative. The head of state may delay the enactment of a law using his suspensory power of veto, but cannot prevent it in the long run. Following this general analysis of German constitutionalism, let us now turn our attention to developments in Austria in particular. The first thing to say is, the Austrian Empire, the first thing to say is that constitutionalism, even in the very watered down variant described here, gained ground relatively late on in the Austrian Empire. Of all states of the German Confederation, Austria was the last to go over to constitutional state. After the failure of the attempt to push this through during the 1848-49 revolution, the transition to a constitutional system did not take place until the 1860s. Basically, in two steps, the so-called Februar Patent of 1861 made the start, followed more notably by the December Constitution of 1867. How to explain the late turn to constitutionalism in the Austrian Empire? How to explain that? Firstly, Austria lacked a strong and assertive middle class, since industrialization had only really got going there in the mid-19th century. A further impediment was that this already insubstantial middle class did not come together into any form of united political power to speak of. On the contrary, it was involved in a range of national movements for whom statehood, it is the foundation of an independent state, let me say a Czech or Hungarian national state, was much more important than fighting for a constitution for the Austrian state as a whole. Secondly, while in Austria, political pressure from below toward constitutionalism was relatively weak, as mentioned, the monarch's resistance to it was particularly pronounced. This was due not only to the fact that Franz Joseph took a marked strictly legitimist stance, but also to the fact that there were indeed solid grounds for viewing constitutionalism as a danger to the integrity of the imperial Austrian state. Constitutionalism, especially in its radical Western variant, in which the idea of constitution is linked to the idea of people's sovereignty, could indeed be viewed as nothing short of a deadly threat to the continuance of the multinational Austrian state. For if the idea of the constitution is linked to the concept of people's sovereignty, then it is a nation which, by virtue of the sovereign power, due to it alone, can grant itself a constitution, itself. Then it is a nation which, in the act of making a constitution, establishes and organizes its own polity. In the Austrian Empire, however, the formation of a unified nation was precluded from the start because, at least from the early 19th century onward, the nation in Europe was understood as a community whose members were bound to one another on the basis of a shared language, culture, and history. In the 19th century Austrian state, this led to the emergence of a number of different national societies. It is the very opposite of a unified nation that could carry the state. There is much to indicate that Franz Josef's obdurate resistance to constitutionalism was based not least on these kinds of considerations. Only when the debacle of losing a war in 1859 and the effect on foreign affairs forced him into granting some concessions, at least some sections of the middle classes, did he allow himself some moves towards constitutional thinking, albeit very hesitantly and only gradually. Moreover, from the beginning, the only option in the question was a constitution imposed by the emperor himself, in order to avoid any move toward the idea of people's sovereignty. And even during the crisis of 1859, the emperor was not prepared to grant a constitution which would have been comprehensively and conclusively contained in a unified constitutional charter, as had been the case for the constitutions in connection with the 1848-49 revolution. Rather showing extreme caution, fearfulness even, the path he followed was to pass individual laws. This began in 1861 with the fundamental law concerning imperial representation. As already mentioned, it was an element of the so-called Februar patent. This fundamental law regulated the establishment of a parliament, the Reichsrat, and its competencies. The second step followed, as mentioned, in 1867 with what was known as a December Constitution. Again, it was a military defeat which forced the emperor to yield. This December Constitution also failed to represent a unified constitution in the sense of a comprehensive and conclusive regulation of the constitutional system as a whole. Rather, it was a collection of individual constitutional laws. However, in terms of content, taken as a whole, these laws formed the constitutional framework of Austria-Cisleithanien as a constitutional monarchy until 1918. In attempting a rough assessment of this December Constitution, we might say that here, contrary to external appearances, it did indeed take up the threats of 1848. The December Constitution made Austria-Cisleithanien a constitutional monarchy of the kind found in the German states and then later in the German Empire. The Reichsrat was a bicameral parliament at least after the electoral reforms of 1873, as was typical of most constitutional monarchies in Europe, in particular England. It also had an elected second chamber, das Abgeordnetenhaus, House of Representatives. Also, the number of eligible voters was very small at first. Ministers' accountability to Parliament was laid down in express terms. The monarch's absolute power of veto over decision of Parliament was also a common feature of German constitutionalism. I mentioned it. Also, the emperor had practically ceased to exercise that right in the second half of the 19th century. In many cases, it didn't even come into question, since the national conflicts frequently rendered the House of Representatives incapable of getting anything done or incorrect. Thus, while the 19th century political reality was that development of the parliamentary element in Austria remained weak on a national level, we actually encounter a relatively well-developed rule of law in the Austrian kind of constitutional monarchy. This is visible not only in the extensive catalogue of fundamental rights contained in the fundamental law on the general rights of the citizens. This fundamental law was also was a part of the December Constitution, but above all in the establishment of a separate constitutional jurisdiction exercised by the so-called Reichsgericht. Famously, this Reichsgericht was the first court, not only within the German states, but within Europe as a whole, to which individual citizens could bring a lawsuit to determine whether one of their fundamental rights, as guaranteed in the Constitution, had been violated. The German Empire was still a long way off this, even at the end of the 19th century, not least because until well into the 20th century, German jurisprudence tended to view the catalogues of basic rights as mere statements of intent to which the citizens could appeal in court only when and to the extent to which they had been given concrete, codified form in the positive law. To sum up, constitutionalism in its Austrian variant contained only a very underdeveloped parliamentarism. Instead, we see a comprehensive control function on the part of the judiciary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And now we come to Dr. Zuzko for her speech, please.
Uvažene dame i gospodo, cijenjeni profesori, srdačno vas selamim i pozdravljam na ovu konferenciju. Dozvolite mi da se nakratko pozdravim i upitam sa našim gostima iz Austrije i Njemačke. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, sehr geehrter Herr Botschafter Pammer, ich bedanke mich herzlichst für diese Konferenz. Vielen Dank für die Gäste auch nicht nur aus Österreich, sondern auch aus Deutschland. Ich werde meinen Vortrag in bosnischer Sprache halten, da wir hier in Sarajevo sind, ich zur islamischen Glaubensgemeinschaft gehöre. Aber gerne können wir unsere Diskussion in der Pause auch in Deutsch fortsetzen. Pitanje mog izlaganja, odnosno tema mog izlaganja, jedna tema koja se tiče, vrlo ozbiljna tema, vrlo ozbiljno pitanje 21. stoljeća, tako da se sada izlazimo polako iz jednog historijskog okvira i bavimo se aktuelnim pitanjima, a to je odnos islamske zajednice u Bosni i Hercegovini i države Bosne i Hercegovine. Ja ću se baviti pitanjem sporazuma koji je islamska zajednica nastoji da potpiše sa državom Bosnom i Hercegovinom. I prije nego što se bavimo sa trenutnim pregovorima, želim da se upoznamo ove naredne 3 folije sa pravnim okvirima, u stvari šta znači nudi normativne akte, šta oni nude po pitanju položaja vjerskih zajednica u državi Bosne i Hercegovine, po pitanju odnosa vjere i položaj vjere i religijskih zajednica u javnom prostoru Bosne i Hercegovine. Na prvom mjestu naravno je važno uočiti i upoznati se sa Ustavom Bosne i Hercegovine koji je bio sastavni dio mirovnog sporazuma i u preambuli kao i svim preambulama uobičajeno u ustavima se spominje jednakost, pravda, tolerancija, demokratski organi vlasti, pravične procedure, pluralističko društvo. Naravno i izričito se spominje univerzalna deklaracija o ljudskim pravima Ujedinjenih nacija, spominje se međunarodne konvencije o građanskim političkim pravima i kulturnim pravima. U daljem tekstu Ustava Bosne i Hercegovine, član 2, izričito se tiče ljudska prava i osnovne slobode i tu citiram, Bosna i Hercegovina i oba entiteta će osigurati najviši nivo međunarodno priznatih ljudskih prava i osnovnih sloboda. Zatim nastavlja prava i slobode predviđene u Europskoj konvenciji za zaštitu ljudskih prava i osnovnih sloboda i u njenim protokolima se direktno primjenjuju u Bosni i Hercegovini. I ovo što je važno, ovi akti imaju prioritet nad svim ostalim zakonima. I tu želim spomenuti Europsku konvenciju o ljudskim pravima, koja stoji iznad, ima prioritet iznad ostalih zakona Bosne i Hercegovine i tu je što tiče sloboda misli, savjesti, vjeroispovijesti je član 9 zadužen i također univerzalna deklaracija ljudskim pravima 1948. godine član 18. I važno je istaći, pogotovo jer smo ove godine imali jednu javnu debatu o odluci Visokog sudskog i tužilačkog vijeća po pitanju religijskih simbola. Važno je istaći ova dva taj član 9 iz Europske konvencije o ljudskim pravima i ove 2 stavke. Znači, svako ima pravo na slobodu misli, savjesti i vjere i to pravo uključuje slobodu na promjenu vjere ili uvjerenje i slobodu zajedno, znači individualno i zajedno sa drugim, javno ili privatno, znači ovdje govorimo o tom javnom prisustvu, da se religija manifestira i sa obredima, propovijedanjem i vršenjem vjerskih dužnosti i rituala. S tim što pojedinačne države mogu to ugroziti, kao što stavka 2 to i kaže, znači sloboda manifestiranja svoje vjere ili svojih uvjerenja će podlijegati samo onim ograničenjima predviđenim zakonom i koja su neophodna u demokratskom društvu interesu javne sigurnosti, zaštite javnog poretka, zdravlja ili morala ili zaštite prava i sloboda drugih. Znači samo ukoliko je javna sigurnost, javni poredak, zdravlje ili moral, odnosno prava i sloboda drugih, ukoliko je ugrožena, država bi imala pravo da ograniči slobodu vjere svojih građana. S obzirom da je Bosna i Hercegovina izdala jedan dodatni zakon, to je ovaj zakon o slobodi vjere i pravnom položaju crkava i vjerskih zajednica u Bosni i Hercegovini iz 2004. godine, vrijedi ići u detalje vezano za ovaj zakon. Upravo i ovaj zakon o slobodi vjere spominje i preporučuje da se potpiše sporazum sa pojedinačnim crkvama, odnosno vjerskim zajednicama. Član 1 spominje taj vrlo važan princip jednakosti. jednakosti svih crkava i vjerskih zajednica u Bosni i Hercegovini. Zatim član 3, neću ja sad redom čitati, ali važno je biti upoznat sa tim sadržajima ovog zakona o slobodi vjere. Član 3 naime govori da su vlasti entiteta, kantona, distrikta i općina, i to je možda važno za naše goste koji su došli iz Austrije i Njemačke. Taj Dejtonski mirovni sporazum koji sadrži ovaj naš ustav je eksperimentisao, da kažem, ustrojstvo Bosne i Hercegovine. Imamo sada znači organe na državnom nivou, na entitetskom nivou, 2 entiteta su stvorena, a dok jedan entitet, Republika Srpska kao ima unitarno uređenje, a drugi entitet Federacija ima u stvari još dodatne kantone, i svaki taj nivo ima u stvari svoju legislativu, eksekutivu, judikativu, što čini zakonodavstvo općenito i funkcionisanje države Bosne i Hercegovine vrlo složenim pitanjem, vrlo komplikovano. Uglavnom, znači, govorimo o tom, ti pojedinačni nivoi vlasti su dužni osigurati prava na slobodu uživanja i ispovijedanja vjere i zabrane svake diskriminacije zasnovane na vjeri ili drugom uvjerenju. Nastavlja dalje član 4, gdje se spominje slobodu javnog ispovijedanja, skoro identično kako to stoji u tim međunarodnim konvencijama, individualno ili u zajednici, javno i privatno, da se znači očituju svoja vjerska osjećanja, da se izvršava vjerska praksa. Član 5 zabranjuje napade i uvrede vjerskih službenika, oštećenja vjerskih objekata i druge imovine crkava i vjerskih zajednica i bilo koje vrste aktivnosti koje su usmjerene narušavanju integriteta drugih vjerskih zajednica i crkava. Član 8 govori o historijskom kontinuitetu islamske zajednice u Bosni i Hercegovini, rimokatoličke crkve, srpske pravoslavne crkve i jevrejske zajednice, i ovaj član je također primijenjen u sporazuma koji su potpisani sa katoličkom crkvom i srpskom pravoslavnom crkvom. Također se afirmiše u okviru ovog zakona sekularno uređenje Bosne i Hercegovine, da su crkve i vjerske zajednice odvojene od države. I ovaj član 15 upravo govori o tome da sva druga pitanja koja nisu obuhvaćena u okviru ovog zakona i koja se tiču položaja i djelovanja crkava i vjerskih zajednica bi se trebali urediti jednim sporazumom, odnosno ugovorom koje zaključuje predsjedništvo, vijeće ministara, vlade, entiteta i naravno predstavnici crkava i vjerskih zajednica. A nadležno za vođenje pregovora nadležno je Ministarstvo za ljudska prava i izbjeglice. I još se trebamo suočiti sa ova naredne 3 tačke vezano za pravni okvir. Jeste Ustav Federacije, kao što sam najavila, imamo mi Ustav na razini države, ali imamo i ustave na razini entiteta. Ustav Federacije Bosne i Hercegovine iz 1994. godine oslanja se također izričito, vrlo decidno na međunarodne konvencije ljudskih prava i član 2
and Article 2 of the Constitution discusses the human rights and fundamental freedoms, prohibiting any discrimination based on religion and talking about the freedom of religion, including private and public. The Republika Srpska Constitution of 1992 mentions the rule of law, pluralist society, the protection of human rights and freedoms, prohibition of discrimination, and in Article 2 on human rights and freedoms, Article 10 on equality of citizens before the law and in terms of religion, but it is not, the international conventions are not mentioned specifically. Just these key notions are mentioned. There's also the law on the prohibition of discrimination of 2009. So in all these, in the legal framework, we have the principle of separation between churches and religious communities and the state, but it is also recommended to cooperate, to collaborate. So this is the principle of separation, but with collaboration. The reason for the agreement between religious communities, between the Islamic community and the state, are the agreements signed by Catholic Church and Sub-Orthodox Church with the state. In 2006, the Catholic Church, actually Vatican, signed the agreement. And given that Vatican is a sovereign state, this is an agreement of international character and international law agreement or an international treaty. This agreement, this treaty, was used as a model for all other agreements signed later on. In 2007, the Sub-Orthodox Church signed this agreement. The Sub-Orthodox Church does not have international personality like Vatican, but they have the headquarters outside of Bosnia and Herzegovina. When one reads the agreements, they are almost identical, the agreements with Catholic Church and Serb-Orthodox Church. So let's see what happens with this agreement between the Islamic community and Bosnia and Herzegovina. 1 year after the agreement with the Serb-Orthodox Church was signed, the Islamic community started the negotiations with the state to conclude this agreement. Compared with the agreements with the Catholic Church and Orthodox Church, this would be an agreement within the international, within the national legal framework. The Islamic community and Muslims are guaranteed the rights equal to other religious communities without any discrimination, talking about the principle of equality, whether philosophically, sociologically, or politically speaking. If we talk about equal treatment, it also implies that one has to respect specific needs of the respective entities, in this case, the specific needs of religious practice of Muslims. The draft agreement that is being negotiated on, this process has taken 8 years now. One can see that the disputed issue is actually the religious practice of Muslims. And about 80 to 90% of the provisions are almost identical with the agreements with churches. These common issues and interests of Roman Catholic Church, Serb-Orthodox community, and Islamic community will be my topic for the next 2 slides. In all of these agreements, both the signed ones and this draft agreement, the centuries long presence of these churches and the Islamic community is mentioned, and the respect for constitution, secular order in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as freedom of religion, independence and self-standing status of both the state and the religious communities is mentioned, and churches, the personality and freedom to communicate and have links with related institutions in the country and abroad, the right to religious freedom, the religious practice, administration, religious instruction, etc., is mentioned in the terms of Islamic community. The religious instruction can be conducted both in public institutions and private institutions, the right to independent financial management, and the right to internal structure and appointment of officers, the inviolability of official premises, and in case of investigations initiated against the religious officers, the religious communities, and its authorities need to be informed prior. We have also 5 days off as holidays that each religious community can use during the year. A common interest is the right to buy or possess or use movables and immovable property, and the foundation of wakufs and endowments, the restitution of nationalized property for which no compensation was paid. This is very important. But the agreements provide that separate laws will be dealing with this. This is a very delicate issue because we are talking about the property of religious communities and churches that was taken back in the socialist Yugoslavia and even before in the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The right to build or adapt religious places of worship, the freedom of printing and distributing books, newspapers, magazines, audiovisual and radio and TV, the right to public speech and writing, the right to establish educational institutions at all levels, primary school, secondary school, and universities, and managing these institutions according to one's own rules, and the personnel and students having the same rights as those in state educational institutions, and that their the graduation diplomas are recognized, the right to organize religious service in the armed forces, police, prisons, hospitals, the right of parents to have their children receive religious education in schools, primary and secondary, and textbooks and religious teachers authorized by the religious community. So all of these issues are identical for all churches and for the Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The issues that have not been discussed much because they were not disputed. So this is the 80 or 90% of identical provisions, but the disputable issues are these: the specific needs of religious practice of Muslims. In Article 9 of the draft agreement covers this area. Article 11 mentions primarily that Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina have the right to perform daily prayers without hindering the regular workflow at work, of course, to have breaks for the obligatory Friday prayer for men, to have the right for iftar and sahur during the month of Ramadan. These are the fast breaking meals and the meal prior to the start of fast. The right to days off to perform Hajj, to take the vacation to perform Hajj in Mecca, the right to express religion in the choice of food, halal food at work, the right to visual identity of Muslims, especially women wearing hijab and men with beards. Also, something that other agreements do not have, the freedom of using signs, flags, and symbols of the Islamic community. This is important because the Islamic community would have exclusive authority to interpret Islamic practice and rules, what is halal, what is haram, what is allowed, what is forbidden in Islam, and in terms of certification of halal products as well. This is also important because of some more recent interpretations of Islam in Bosnia and Herzegovina and some NGOs trying to interpret Islam in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This way, the Islamic community would be involved in the process of deciding whether such NGOs could be registered with the Ministry of Justice. Then the establishment of faith-based organizations and the right to slaughter in a halal way and the right to male circumcision. So these are the so-called disputable issues that led to 8 years of negotiations. Very often these draft agreements were returned to the Islamic community, which had to try and show that these are religious practices of Muslims that are essential for the members of Islam, for Muslims. Let's talk about the situation regarding the freedom of religion of Muslims in daily routine. I use the report of the Commission for Freedom of Religion of the Islamic Community. And there's also the annual report of the Interreligious Council on attacks against religious sites and offices of the Islamic community. These two reports, we can see that there is unequal application of law on freedom of religion. For example, Muslim women with hijab are often discriminated at the labor market. There's the lack of prayer facilities at work. Friday prayer is difficult to perform during the working hours, although according to the law, as an employee, you have the right to take 1 hour of break a week, but this is dealt with on individual basis. The employee needs to ask the employer for permission for this 1 hour off during the week, whatever the employee is doing over this 1 hour. But this agreement would with this issue for Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Then the employees of the armed forces and police complained that they are not allowed to wear beards or headscarves. There are verbal attacks against Muslims, especially in the Republika Srpska. Some translation was left on the slide, translation to English, and some attacks on mosques, Muslim graveyards, and buildings of the Islamic community, especially in the Republika Srpska. So, let's say something about the negotiation process and the current status of the agreement. The Islamic community complied with the procedure that other churches applied. The Ministry of Human Rights prepared the basis. The negotiating team was set up on behalf of the ministry as well as on the Islamic community. The draft agreement was agreed on, and it was even approved by the Council of Ministers in 2015. And then we were hoping that this issue would be dealt with soon. The next instance after the Council of Ministers is the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the agreement is currently stuck there. This issue has not been discussed at the session of the presidency. We are still awaiting answers. For you who do not live in Bosnia and Herzegovina, let me just say that according to the constitution, all three ethnic groups are respected according to the constitution. So there are 3 different groups in each government body or authority. So the presidency has 1 Bosniak member, 1 Croat member, and 1 Serb member. After the presidency, the next step would be the ratification of the agreement at the parliament, and finally and hopefully the official signature of this agreement. So what did we conclude from this process? That the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina is in breach of its own laws, that the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina does not fully act in the best interest of its citizens. It's well known that Bosnia and Herzegovina has always been a country with various religions and religious communities for many, many years. But 1 year after the Austro-Hungarian rule in 1879, there was the first population census conducted. This census, after 450 years of Ottoman rule, there were 43% of Orthodox members, 38% Muslims, 18% of Catholics, and 0.2% Jews. The number of Jews was to rise significantly during the Austro-Hungarian rule, given that the Ashkenazi Jews came to Bosnia, and the percentage rose to 0.6%. But today, we have the results of the 2013 census. The population, about 3.5 million, 50.11% Bosniaks, 78% Serbs, 15.43% Croats. So this is just for the sake of information. So the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina fails to act in the best interest of its citizens. I'm talking about the percentage of almost 50%.
There is a definitive lack of will to sign the agreement, and we can talk openly about discrimination against Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Yesterday, I talked to the lawyer of the Riyasat of the Islamic community here, and he also said that it's very important to point out this discrimination against the Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, the question is whether Bosnia and Herzegovina, even today, is a model for organization of religious communities and churches, if it is ignoring or trying to prevent the agreement to be signed. And now I come to the end of my presentation. These are the conclusions. We have a hybrid model of separation and cooperation between the state and the church. We have some issues that have been resolved, such as the autonomy, managing internal and external affairs, education. We have a lot of outstanding issues as well, which have been taken out of the agreement signed and the draft agreement of the Islamic community, and that is recognizing religious weddings, contribution of the state to the pension and health insurance of religious officers, and restitution of the property. We have some specificities of Islamic religious practice, the namaz prayer, Juma, Friday prayer, Hajj, visual identity, halal, food, kurban, and circumcision. Urgent issues concern the agreement between the Islamic community and the state with all the specificities of the Islamic religious practice. Also that the legislation and regulations in Bosnia and Herzegovina should be harmonized better and applied, not just to exist de jure, but also to be applied de facto with all the realities in Bosnia and Herzegovina to ensure the freedom of religion. And also, I think it is very important to implement the projects and education programs in order to raise awareness of the Islamic religious practices and to condemn and prevent verbal and physical attacks against Muslims and the property of the Islamic community. Thank you very much.
thank you very much to all the speakers for the wonderful speeches and comprehensive speeches they gave. And first I would like to the podium, if there are some questions of one to the other, or everything is fine. So we have no questions. You can talk to yourself and ask yourself, but there's nobody here. But we have about 7 minutes for the discussion. I'm sorry because we are late and we have to be back. Then we have a break, a coffee break, and I would like to ask you to be back at 11 o'clock. But please, your question. Could you get up or louder? We don't hear you at the floor. Okay, go ahead.
There can be no interpretation without microphone. I would like to hear if in the draft agreement that you talked about, is it included that the leave is not paid by the employer? Does it precisely state that this is unpaid leave and the breaks and the vacation to go and perform Hajj? The Hajj obligation would be within the vacation time, so this should be treated as any other vacation. You are entitled to a vacation, and the time when the Hajj is supposed to be performed changes during the year. It's not usually or always in the summer. As for the Friday prayer, whether paid or unpaid, now the idea is we looked at the contract that the Spanish state has with the Islamic community in Spain. Their contract specifies that this is unpaid in order to prevent abuse of that break. Now, in our agreement, this is not precisely stated. So this is not mentioned at all, whether it's paid or unpaid. And it's not even a contested issue. I know, I think and I hope I've been clear when I spoke. These specific needs of the Islamic religious practice is not something that should create a cost for the state or the employer. Now, the specific religious practices does not cause any additional burden to the employer or the government, the state, because it is clearly stated that the course of business operations cannot be threatened. So if someone is working at a factory line, for example, manufacturing line, and this needs to be, obviously there needs to be someone there. He cannot just leave and disturb the whole manufacturing operation. That is very clear. Now, this is clearly stated that this cannot be to the detriment of business operations or the employers or the business results.
Other question? Do we have another question from the floor or from the audience? Please, Ambassador.
Very simple, lack of political will. Vrlo jasno, manjak političke volje, htjenja.
The lack of political will, the readiness to sign the agreement. Discrimination against Muslims. Well, your answer that there's no political will, I mean, we hear that very often, but what does that exactly mean? I mean, what is the exact reasons why the Council of Ministers and the presidency are not willing to approve of that? It's lack of understanding for the needs of the Muslims. I read the protocols and the reports and the different answers we got from different ministries and the negotiating team of the Council of Ministers. We can see that there is a great lack of understanding for religious practices of the Muslims, and that's why it's one of my recommendations to raise awareness about that. And in those documents, we say, well, just copy the identity contract that you have with the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, and there won't be a problem. However, if we talk about the principle of equality, we need to respect the needs of that specific community of Muslims. We are also experiencing blockade from non-Bosniak politicians who are using the atmosphere and the political situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the freedom that they don't really have to act totally in accordance with the legal system or the rule of law.
Well, if this is not the case, I thank the speakers for their presentations. And we have a coffee break now, and I would like to ask you to be back precisely at 11 o'clock. We have 15 minutes. Thank you so much.